The air in the Luminescence was a carefully curated symphony of hushed conversations and the delicate clinking of crystal against fine china. It smelled of money, of seared scallops and old-world perfume, a scent so far removed from Emma Martinez's world that it felt like breathing a different element. But tonight all that expensive air had been sucked out of the room, replaced by a silence so thick it was a physical weight. Every eye, whether pretending to study a menu or gaze out at the glittering Manhattan skyline, was fixed on table 7, and at the center of that silent storm was Emma. Her hand, trembling almost imperceptibly, hovered over the polished mahogany. On the table, nestled beside the limp, long-fingered hand of a supposedly sleeping Alexander Pierce, lay a thick stack of $100 bills, held together by a gleaming silver money clip. The bills were crisp, impossibly clean, a fortune that could solve every problem that kept Emma awake at night. Her waitress apron suddenly felt like a costume, flimsy and absurd. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the restaurant's soft jazz. He looked so vulnerable, this titan of industry, this man whose name was a synonym for power. Head tilted back against the plush velvet of his chair, his chiseled features were relaxed in a deep, convincing slumber. But Emma knew with a chilling certainty that crawled up her spine that this was a performance. She could feel his scrutiny even through his closed eyelids. This was a test, a trap, and she was walking right into it. The choice was simple and impossible. Leave the money to be potentially stolen by someone less honest, or act and risk the wrath of the most formidable man she had ever met. The collective breath of the restaurant was held, waiting. How did she end up here? The focus of a billionaire's cruel game. To understand the crushing weight of that single loaded moment, one had to go back 3 weeks, to a world of cracked pavement and the scent of frying onions, a world away from the gilded cage of the Luminescence. 3 weeks earlier, Emma's world was a small third-floor walk-up in Queens that she shared with her abuela, Elena. The apartment was filled with the things that truly mattered. The worn-out armchair where Elena spent her afternoons, a bookshelf overflowing with second-hand novels, and the constant, comforting aroma of herbs and spices that clung to the very walls. Emma's life was a tapestry of quiet struggles and fierce, unwavering love. Her days were a meticulous ballet of budgeting, of stretching every dollar to cover rent, utilities, and the rising cost of Elena's medication. Her dream, a secret she held close to her heart like a fragile bird, was a community kitchen, a place where no one in her neighborhood would ever have to choose between paying for electricity and putting a warm meal on the table. The dream lived in a faded, leather-bound recipe book passed down from her mother, its pages stained with vanilla and love. "You have your mother's hands, Mija," Elena would say, her voice a soft, raspy whisper as she watched Emma knead dough on their small kitchen counter. "They are made to create, to give," but creating and giving required resources Emma simply didn't have. The notice from the diner where she'd worked for 2 years, announcing its sudden closure, had been a physical blow. Panic, cold and sharp, had gripped her. That panic was what led her to the online job posting for the Luminescence, a place so far beyond her reality it might as well have been on another planet. The interview had been a blur of polished marble floors, intimidating managers in sharp suits and questions that made her feel small and unsophisticated. Yet, something in her quiet dignity, in the steady, honest gaze she held, must have struck a chord. She got the job. If your heart is also racing for Emma in this moment of impossible choice, leave a like to show your support for her journey. Her first shift felt like stepping onto a movie set. The Luminescence wasn't just a restaurant, it was a theater of power. Men and women with impossibly perfect hair and clothes that cost more than her rent spoke in low, confident tones about mergers and acquisitions, about summering in the Hamptons and wintering in Aspen. Emma learned to move silently among them, a ghost in a black uniform, her face a polite, neutral mask. She learned the intricate dance of serving from the left and clearing from the right, of pouring vintage wine without letting a single drop touch the pristine white tablecloth. And she learned about Alexander Pierce. He wasn't just the owner. He was the restaurant's resident deity, a silent, brooding presence who commanded fear and respect in equal measure. The staff spoke of him in whispers. "Don't make eye contact unless he speaks to you first. A senior waiter had warned her on her first day. He notices everything. A crooked fork, a smudge on a glass, a single mistake, and you're gone. Every Thursday, precisely at 8 o'clock, Alexander Pierce would arrive. He always sat at table 7, the one with the panoramic view of the city lights. He never came with anyone. He would order the same thing, a steak, medium rare, and a glass of scotch, neat. And he would watch. His eyes, the color of a gathering storm, would sweep across the dining room, missing nothing. Emma felt his gaze on her more than once, a heavy, analytical pressure that made her hands sweat. He wasn't looking at her, she realized, so much as looking through her, as if she were a piece of furniture, a part of the scenery he owned. In the 2 weeks she'd worked there, she had never seen him smile, not once. His face was a mask of cold, chiseled control. Emma tried to see him as just a part of the job, a particularly daunting obstacle to navigate in her quest to provide for her abuela. She focused on her tasks, on remembering the daily specials, on keeping her movements fluid and efficient. She funneled her earnings into a small tin box hidden under her mattress, each crumpled bill a tiny step closer to her dream. She was invisible, and for her, invisibility was safety. She was just a waitress, a temporary fixture in a world she would never belong to. She served men like Alexander Pierce, men who held the fate of thousands in their hands, and would never ever know her name or the weight of the dreams she carried on her tired shoulders. The Thursday of the test began like any other. Emma kissed her abuela's soft, wrinkled cheek before she left, promising to bring home a leftover bread roll if she could. The subway ride into Manhattan felt like a descent into another realm, the familiar sounds and smells of Queens giving way to the cold, impersonal hum of the city's financial heart. As she polished wine glasses behind the service bar, she could feel a strange tension in the air. The staff was quieter than usual, their movements more rigid. She didn't know then that Alexander had laid the groundwork for his cruel experiment, that he had already decided she would be the subject. All she knew was that when he walked in at 8 o'clock on the dot, his stormy eyes seemed to hold a flicker of something different tonight, not just observation, but intent. The night was poised on the edge of a knife, and Emma was about to be pushed right over it. The city of New York woke in layers, a slow crescendo of sound and light that began in the outer boroughs and surged toward the glittering heart of Manhattan. For Emma Martinez, the day began long before the sun touched the steel canyons she would later serve. Her world was a third-floor walk-up in Queens, a place of worn but lovingly polished wood floors, the scent of lavender from her grandmother's sachets, and the quiet hum of a life built on resilience. The alarm clock, a relic from a decade past, buzzed at precisely 5:30 in the morning. She silenced it with a practiced hand, swinging her legs out of bed and into the pre-dawn chill. Her first stop was always her grandmother's room. Abuela Elena was asleep, her breathing a soft, rhythmic whisper in the dim light. A small silver cross hung from a chain around her neck, rising and falling with each breath. Emma gently adjusted the worn quilt, her fingers brushing against her grandmother's paper-thin skin. It was for this woman, for the mountain of medical bills that sat in a neat but daunting pile on the kitchen table, that Emma made the journey each day into a world that felt like a foreign country. Her dream of a community kitchen, a place that would serve warm meals and warmer welcomes, felt impossibly distant, a ghost of a future she could barely afford to imagine. "I'll be back late, Abuela," she whispered to the sleeping form, a promise she made every day. The subway ride was a study in contrasts. She would descend into the rumbling, chaotic belly of the city in Queens, surrounded by the tired faces of nurses, construction workers, and fellow service staff, the invisible gears that kept the great machine of New York turning. They shared a silent camaraderie, an understanding of early mornings and long hours. Then, an hour later, she would emerge from the station at 59th and 5th, stepping into a reality of polished brass, uniformed doormen, and the hushed, expensive purr of luxury cars. The air itself seemed different here, thinner, crisper, as if filtered through money. The Luminescence was the pinnacle of this world, a glass temple where her simple black uniform felt like an admission of otherness. If you find yourself rooting for Emma to find the strength to overcome these challenges, please show your support with a like, so we know her story is touching your heart. Across the city, in a penthouse that floated above the noise and the struggle, Alexander Pierce's day began not with an alarm, but with the silent, automated slide of blackout curtains revealing a panoramic vista of his kingdom. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling glass, a cup of black coffee in hand, watching the city awaken below. But he felt no connection to it, only a sense of sterile ownership. The faces in the streets were a blur, the individual lives inconsequential data points in the vast economic equations he manipulated with ease. His world was one of numbers, of acquisitions and leveraged buyouts. It was clean, logical, and devoid of the messy, unpredictable variable of human emotion. A memory, sharp and unwelcome, pierced his morning calm. His former business partner, a man he had once considered a friend, smiling across a boardroom table just hours before, executing a betrayal that had cost Alexander millions and, more significantly, the last vestiges of his trust. That was 7 years ago. Since then, he had rebuilt his empire into an impregnable fortress, its walls constructed from cynicism and a deeply ingrained belief that every person had a price, a hidden angle, an agenda. Integrity, he had concluded, was a commodity people claimed to possess, but were always willing to sell. This belief was why he spent his Thursday evenings at the Luminescence, not for the Michelin-starred food or the vintage wine, but to observe. It was his private laboratory, a place to study the human animal in its most performative state. He watched politicians feign sincerity, socialites trade manufactured smiles, and his own staff offer a level of deference that he knew was purchased, not earned. And then there was Emma Martinez. In her first 2 weeks, she had become an anomaly, a persistent blip on his radar of calculated expectations. He had started noticing her on his second Thursday. She moved with a quiet efficiency that was different from the others. There was no fawning, no desperate attempt to catch his eye for a larger tip. She was respectful but not servile, her focus entirely on the task at hand. He saw the way she discreetly helped an elderly patron who had dropped her napkin, the gentle patience she showed a younger waiter who was clearly overwhelmed. These were small things, almost imperceptible, yet they stood in stark contrast to the transactional nature of everything around him. His initial reaction was suspicion. It had to be an act, a more sophisticated performance designed to achieve some unknown end. No one was that guileless, no one was that genuinely decent. The thought began to fester, an intellectual puzzle he felt compelled to solve. He had his head of security run a background check, a standard procedure, he told himself, for all new staff at his flagship property. The file that landed on his desk was painfully, almost insultingly, ordinary. Emma Martinez, 26 years old, resided in Queens, sole caregiver for her ailing grandmother. No criminal record, no debts, other than the crushing medical ones. A high school graduate with 1 semester of community college before her grandmother's health had declined. It was a life of quiet, unremarkable struggle. The file should have dismissed his curiosity, but it only amplified it. Her simplicity was, in his world, the most complex riddle of all. Was this unassuming waitress the one person who could prove his entire worldview wrong, or was she simply the most convincing performer he had ever encountered? The thought was a challenge he could not resist. An experiment began to form in his mind, cold and precise. He would create a scenario where the performance had to drop, where the cost of integrity would be pitted directly against the temptation of easy gain. A test. He would orchestrate it for the following Thursday. The details solidified with chilling clarity. He would dine alone, as always. He would order the sea bass, his usual, and at the end of the meal, he would feign a deep, wine-induced sleep. On the table, easily accessible, he would place his money clip thick with $100 bills, $5,000 in total. Enough to be life-changing for someone like her. Enough to be an irresistible temptation. He would leave it exposed, a calculated display of vulnerability. Then he would watch. He would wait to see what the quiet waitress from Queens would do when she believed no one was looking. When she thought the most powerful man in the room was helpless. He needed to prove to himself that his cynicism was justified, that the fortress he had built around his life was necessary. He needed to see her fail the test, to confirm that her quiet dignity was just another mask. The decision settled within him. heavy and cold as stone, a trap meticulously designed not just for her, but to reaffirm the grim, lonely truths of his own world. The luminescence on that Thursday evening felt different. It was as if the air itself, usually thick with the scent of money and expensive perfume, had been charged with an invisible current, a low hum of anticipation that vibrated just beneath the surface of the polite conversations and the soft strains of a distant piano. The crystal chandeliers seemed to cast sharper, more interrogative shards of light across the polished mahogany and deep velvet upholstery. It was a stage meticulously set, waiting for its drama to unfold. When Alexander Pierce arrived, precisely at 8 o'clock as he always did, the current intensified. He moved through the dining room not like a man entering a space, but like a king surveying his domain. His presence commanded a quiet, almost reverential deference. The maître d' bowed a fraction lower. The sommelier approached with a heightened sense of caution. But Alexander's eyes, the color of a gathering storm, bypassed them all. They swept the room with a predatory stillness until they found their target, Emma Martinez, refilling a water glass at a table across the room. Emma felt the weight of his gaze like a physical touch. Her hand, usually so steady, trembled almost imperceptibly as she set the carafe down. For the past 2 weeks, Alexander Pierce had been a remote, formidable figure, a force of nature she observed from a safe distance. But tonight, that distance had collapsed. She could feel him watching her every move as she cleared plates, as she took an order, as she smoothed her crisp black apron. It was an unnerving, invasive scrutiny that made the back of her neck prickle with a cold dread. She ran through a mental checklist of her actions. Was her uniform immaculate? Yes. Was her service prompt and unobtrusive? She believed so. Then why did she feel like a specimen under a microscope? The thought was a persistent, nagging whisper. What does he want? Alexander ate his meal with the same methodical precision he applied to his business dealings. He tasted the wine, a rare vintage, with a critical nod. He cut his steak into perfectly symmetrical pieces, but his focus was not on the food, it was on Emma. He observed the way she interacted with other patrons, a quiet warmth, a genuine, unforced smile for an elderly couple celebrating their anniversary. He watched her discreetly pick up a fallen napkin for a boisterous businessman without interrupting his story. He saw a steadfastness, a quiet dignity that seemed utterly out of place in a world he knew to be transactional and hollow. And that, he thought with a familiar twist of cynicism, was precisely what made her the perfect subject for his experiment. Integrity, in his experience, was merely a performance, and he was about to see what it would take to make Emma's mask slip. If you want to see how a person's true character is revealed, you must give them the opportunity to betray it. Se a dignidade dela chocou você, deixe like para que o algoritmo entenda que histórias como essa importam. The moment came after he had finished his espresso. He leaned back in his plush velvet chair, his movements slow and deliberate. He allowed his head to loll to one side, his eyes closing as if surrendering to a deep, wine-induced slumber. His right hand, which had been resting on his thigh, slid down to the edge of the table, coming to a rest just inches from his plate. As it did, the sleeve of his tailored jacket pulled back, revealing not just his expensive watch, but the thick, gleaming money clip nestled beside it. It held a dense stack of $100 bills, an amount that represented more than a year's rent for Emma's small apartment in Queens. The cash was exposed, vulnerable, a beacon of temptation in the dim, opulent light. The atmosphere in the luminescence shifted instantly. The low hum of conversation faltered. A couple at a nearby table fell silent, their eyes flicking from the sleeping billionaire to the shocking pile of money. Across the room, 2 waiters froze mid-stride, exchanging a wide-eyed, panicked look. Even the pianist seemed to miss a note. Everyone saw it. Everyone understood the unspoken question hanging in the air. The restaurant, a moment ago a cathedral of commerce, had transformed into a silent theater, its patrons and staff now a captive audience to a high-stakes morality play. Emma saw it too. Her heart, which had been beating a nervous rhythm all evening, gave a single violent thud against her ribs. She was clearing a nearby table when she noticed the shift, the sudden unnatural quiet. Her eyes followed the collective gaze and landed on table 7, on Alexander Pierce, seemingly passed out. And on the money. Her first thought was a jolt of protective panic. He's going to be robbed. The man was a pillar of New York finance. The contents of that money clip were likely a rounding error to him, but the principle of the thing was staggering. To leave that much cash exposed in a public place was reckless, an invitation to disaster. Her second thought was professional. If anything happened to that money on her watch, in her section, her job would be the least of her worries. The Luminescence prided itself on discretion and security. A theft from its most powerful patron would be an unforgivable stain. She looked around. The other staff members were paralyzed, caught between the fear of approaching the formidable Alexander Pierce and the fear of doing nothing. The patrons were spectators, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and feigned indifference. No one was going to do anything. It was up to her. A cold wave of anxiety washed over Emma. This was a trap. Not a deliberate one, she thought, but a situational one. If she walked away and the money vanished, she would be blamed for her negligence. But if she approached, if she touched the money, the implication was even worse. In a world that judged people like her on sight, a waitress's hand on a billionaire's cash was a confession, not a rescue. Her mind raced, weighing the impossible choices. She thought of her grandmother, of the mounting medical bills, of the quiet strength in her tired eyes. She thought of her dream, that small, impossible dream of a community kitchen, a place of warmth and sustenance built on honesty and hard work. Losing this job wouldn't just be a setback, it would be a catastrophe. But what was the alternative? To stand by and watch a disaster unfold, to betray the very principles her grandmother had instilled in her. Responsibility, integrity. You do the right thing, Mija, especially when it's hard. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind, cutting through the fear. It was decided. Her hands grew damp, and she quickly, discreetly, wiped them on her apron. Taking a deep, steadying breath, Emma began to walk toward table 7. The journey felt like it took an eternity. Each step was a conscious, deliberate act. The plush carpet seemed to muffle the sound of her own frantic heartbeat, but she was certain everyone in the room could hear it. She kept her eyes fixed on Alexander Pierce, her posture straight, her expression a careful mask of professional concern. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her back, dissecting her, judging her. The air was so thick with tension it felt hard to breathe. She finally reached the table. Up close, Alexander Pierce looked less like he was sleeping and more like a marble effigy of power. His face was a mask of calm, but a tiny muscle twitched in his chiseled jaw. His breathing was too even, too rhythmic. A flicker of suspicion ignited in Emma's mind, a terrifying thought that this was somehow intentional, but she pushed it away. It was too bizarre, too cruel to contemplate. Her gaze dropped to the money clip. The bills were crisp, new, the face of Benjamin Franklin staring up at the ornate ceiling. It was a fortune, sitting there for the taking. For a fleeting, dizzying second, she imagined what that money could do. Pay off every debt, secure her grandmother's care, make her dream a reality overnight. The thought was so powerful it made her feel faint. But it was just a thought, a ghost passing through. It wasn't who she was. With a final, silent prayer, Emma leaned forward. Her movements were slow, careful, her hands held out in the open where anyone could see them. She intended to simply pick up the clip, take it directly to the maitre d', and have it secured in the restaurant's safe until Mr. Pierce awoke. It was the only logical, responsible thing to do. She reached out her hand. The silence in the restaurant was now absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket. It was as if the entire city of New York was holding its breath. Her fingers, trembling just slightly, brushed against the cold, smooth metal of the money clip. The silence in the Luminescence was no longer elegant. It was a weapon. It stretched thin and taut across the room, a fragile membrane of decorum that was about to be violently pierced. Emma Martinez's fingers, steady only moments before, now trembled just a millimeter above the cold metallic gleam of the money clip. Every patron, every server, every busboy seemed frozen in a single, collective intake of breath. They were a silent jury, their eyes fixed on the unfolding drama at table 7, a tableau of wealth and vulnerability that felt both staged and terrifyingly real. Then, the weapon was fired. "What exactly do you think you are doing?" The voice wasn't loud, but it sliced through the hushed stillness with the chilling precision of a shard of ice. It was Alexander Pierce's voice, devoid of the feigned slumber that had draped his features. His eyes snapped open, and they were not groggy or confused. They were storm grey, sharp and utterly merciless, pinning Emma in their accusatory glare. The pretense had vanished, leaving behind a cold, predatory focus that stripped the air from her lungs. The trap, so meticulously laid, had been sprung. A wave of heat washed over Emma, so intense it felt like a physical blow. It started in her chest and flooded upward, scalding her neck, her cheeks, her ears. The opulent dining room, with its crystal chandeliers and panoramic city views, suddenly tilted, the soft jazz melody warping into a dissonant thrum inside her head. 100 pairs of eyes were on her now, their curiosity hardening into suspicion, their whispers turning into silent verdicts. She was a fly caught in a web, and the spider was awake, watching. She snatched her hand back as if the money clip were red-hot iron. Her mouth opened, but only a dry, rasping sound emerged. She was being accused. Here, in this cathedral of wealth, before all these powerful people, Alexander Pierce was accusing her of theft. The shame was a physical entity, a heavy cloak that threatened to crush her. But beneath the shame, something else stirred. It was a flicker of defiance, a stubborn ember of integrity that had been forged in a lifetime of quiet battles. She thought of her grandmother's weary but proud face, of the dream for a community kitchen built on honesty and hard work. She would not be extinguished by this man's cruel game. Her voice, when it finally came, was a trembling thread of sound, but it held. "Mr. Pierce." She forced herself to meet his gaze, to look past the billionaire and see the man orchestrating her humiliation. You were asleep, sir, with thousands of dollars on the table." The room held its breath. No one spoke to Alexander Pierce with anything less than perfect deference. Yet this waitress, her face still flushed with shame, was not just speaking to him. She was challenging him. Her own words gave her strength. The trembling in her voice steadied, gaining a quiet resonance that seemed to fill the charged silence. People were watching. Anyone could have walked by. "I wasn't taking your money, Mr. Pierce. I was trying to protect it. I was going to take it to the manager to hold for you until you woke up." She delivered the words without flourish, a simple, unvarnished statement of fact. And that was what broke through his armor. Alexander had expected tears, denials, pleading. He had expected the predictable, groveling fear he was so accustomed to provoking. He had not expected the truth, delivered with a dignity that was as unassailable as it was astonishing. He looked into her eyes and saw no deceit, no avarice. He saw a flicker of fear, yes, but it was overshadowed by an unwavering honesty that was almost luminous. It was a quality he hadn't encountered in years, not in his boardrooms, not in his social circles, not even in his own mirror. He had set out to prove that integrity was a commodity, easily bought or discarded under pressure. Instead, this unassuming woman had shown him it was a fortress. The entire elaborate test, his cynical hypothesis about human nature, it all collapsed into a pile of hollow, ugly rubble at his feet. For the first time, a profound fissure cracked open within the cynical bedrock of his soul. He had judged her, and in doing so, had exposed a profound failing in himself. The feeling was so foreign, so unsettling, that he recoiled from it, retreating to the only defense he knew: protocol, power, control. He straightened in his chair, his expression hardening back into an impenetrable mask of command. The brief flicker of humanity in his eyes was extinguished. "Your concern is noted," he said, his tone clipped and dismissive. "However, your employment here is contingent on following procedure, and the procedure is not to touch a patron's personal belongings for any reason." The words were technically correct, professionally sound, but they felt like a lie in his own mouth. He knew it. Emma knew it. And perhaps even the silent jury of onlookers knew it. "You're dismissed," Alexander Pierce said, the words falling like two stones into a deep well. "Collect your things and leave." A collective, barely audible gasp rippled through the restaurant. The sentence was delivered. The axe had fallen. For a moment, Emma simply stood there, absorbing the final, brutal injustice. He knew she was telling the truth, yet he was firing her anyway. He was sacrificing her, her job, her livelihood, to protect his own pride. The ember of defiance inside her didn't die, but it was banked by a wave of profound, weary sorrow. This was how the world worked. This was the game, and she had just lost. Without another word, she turned. Her walk back to the staff locker room was the longest of her life. She could feel the stairs like 1,000 tiny needles on her back. She didn't look at her co-workers, whose faces were a mixture of pity and fear. She moved with a strange, robotic grace. Her shoulders squared, her head held high, even as her world was crumbling around her. She gathered her meager belongings: a worn-out paperback, a half-eaten granola bar, a faded photo of her and her grandmother tucked into the pocket of her thin coat. As she pushed through the heavy glass doors of the Luminescence and stepped out into the biting New York wind, the tears she had held back finally came. They were hot and silent, carving tracks down her cold cheeks. The city lights blurred into a merciless, glittering smear. Back inside, Alexander Pierce sat alone at table 7. The perfect steak was now cold on his plate. The victory he had engineered tasted like ash. He watched through the vast window as Emma's small, solitary figure hunched against the wind, a lonely silhouette against the indifferent grandeur of the city. The image seared itself into his mind. He had won his little game, proven his power. So why did he feel so utterly, comprehensively defeated? An inexplicable compulsion seized him. It wasn't a thought. It was a physical pull, a force outside of his own rigid control. Leaving his half-eaten meal and the stunned silence of his restaurant behind, he stood up and walked out, his long strides eating up the distance. He caught up to her at the corner, under the humming glow of a streetlight. "Wait!" Emma flinched, turning around. Her eyes were red-rimmed and wary, her face a pale oval in the harsh light. She clutched her coat tighter, as if to shield herself from another blow. Alexander stopped a few feet away from her. The cold air felt sharp in his lungs. For once in his life, the man who commanded boardrooms and moved markets was at a complete loss for words. The carefully constructed sentences, the cutting remarks, the powerful directives, they were all useless here, on this cold sidewalk, in the face of her quiet, wounded dignity. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick envelope. He stepped forward and pressed it into her hand. Her fingers were ice cold. "This," he said, his voice rougher than he intended, "for your trouble." It wasn't an apology, not in words, but it was the only apology he knew how to make, a clumsy, camouflaged act of penance, shrouded in the language of money, because the language of the heart was foreign to him. His eyes, however, betrayed the turmoil within. For a fleeting second, the storm grey softened, holding a flicker of something she had never seen there before: regret. A silent, desperate plea for an understanding he didn't feel he deserved. Emma stared down at the thick envelope in her hand, then back up at his conflicted face. Confusion warred with her pain. The gesture made no sense. This man had just publicly humiliated and fired her, and now he was giving her what looked like more money than she would make in a month. Before she could form a question, he had already turned, walking back toward the impossible warmth and light of the Luminescence, his shoulders set in a rigid line. He was retreating back into his world, leaving her alone in the cold. But something had irrevocably changed. He had sought to test her integrity, and in the process, had been forced to confront the gaping void where his own should have been. What happened on that sidewalk was not an ending. It was the beginning of a reckoning, a profound and painful transformation that had just been sparked into life by the unwavering honesty of a woman he had tried and failed to break. The silence in Emma's small queen's apartment was a world away from the calculated quiet of the Luminescence. For 3 days, it had been her sanctuary and her prison, a place where the memory of 100 pairs of eyes watching her, judging her, played on a torturous loop. The thick envelope Alexander Pierce had pressed into her hand sat on her kitchen counter, unopened. It felt like a brand, a final transactional dismissal that reduced her integrity to a price. She was stirring a pot of chamomile tea for her grandmother, the familiar, comforting scent doing little to soothe the tremor in her own hands, when her phone buzzed, the screen displaying a number she didn't recognize, a sleek, impersonal Manhattan area code. Hesitantly, she answered. "Hello? Ms. Martinez. This is Alexander Pierce." The voice was the same, a low baritone that could command boardrooms, but the razor's edge was gone. In its place was something else, something she couldn't quite name, a fissure of uncertainty. Emma's spine straightened. Mr. Pierce. The name was ice on her tongue. A pause stretched across the line, heavy with unspoken words. "I am calling," he began, his voice measured, "to extend an offer. Not an apology, because words are insufficient for my conduct. This is something else." She waited, her knuckles white around the phone. "I am establishing a new philanthropic entity," he said. "The Pierce Foundation for Urban Integrity. Its mission will be to identify and fund grassroots initiatives that demonstrate authentic community value. Initiatives built on the very principles I so crudely tested. I need someone to help lead it, someone whose judgment I can trust implicitly, someone who understands what integrity looks like when no one is watching." He took a breath. "I'm offering you the position of co-director, Emma." The world tilted. Co-director. The title was so absurd, so disconnected from her reality of counting tips and worrying about rent, that she almost laughed. "Why me?" she managed, the question a raw whisper. "Because you feel guilty?" "No," he answered, and the speed of his denial surprised her. "Because you were right, and I was wrong. I've spent a decade surrounding myself with people who tell me what I want to hear, people who operate on leverage and ambition. I built an empire on predicting behavior, and you defied my prediction. That makes your perspective the most valuable asset I've encountered in years. I am not offering you a job out of pity. I'm offering it because I am a businessman and I cannot afford to lose an asset of your caliber." She looked at the unopened envelope on her counter, then at her grandmother sleeping peacefully in the next room. This wasn't just a job, it was a lifeline wrapped in the most bizarre package imaginable. It was a chance to build the very things she dreamed of, using the resources of the man who had publicly shamed her. A flicker of hope, stubborn and defiant, ignited in her chest. "I accept," she said, her voice clearer now, stronger, "on a trial basis." Their first weeks together were a delicate, unspoken truce. They worked out of a stark, minimalist office on the 42nd floor of his corporate headquarters, a glass-walled space that overlooked the city like a king's private vista. The no-touch barrier between them was a tangible force, a chasm of class, experience, and memory. They were strictly professional, Mr. Pierce and Ms. Martinez. They communicated through project proposals, financial spreadsheets, and formal meetings, their conversations orbiting the safe, neutral territory of their work. Yet slowly, the fortress Alexander had built around himself began to show cracks. It started with small things. He noticed how she'd poured 2 cups of coffee in the morning, placing one on his desk without a word. He observed the quiet dignity with which she handled calls from condescending city officials, her calm persistence disarming their bureaucratic arrogance. He saw the photos of her grandmother tucked into the frame of her computer monitor and found himself asking about her health, the question feeling foreign and clumsy on his tongue. Emma, in turn, began to see beyond the cold, calculating Billionaire. During late-night work sessions fueled by takeout containers of Thai food that replaced the 5-star cuisine of his usual world, she saw the exhaustion in his eyes. She learned that his cynicism was a shield, forged in a brutal betrayal by a former mentor and business partner years ago. He spoke of it once, in a rare moment of vulnerability, his voice low as he described how the man he'd considered a father figure had systematically embezzled millions, nearly destroying his first company. "Trust," Alexander had said, staring out at the city lights, "is a liability I chose to eliminate from my balance sheet." Their shared projects became the bridge across their divide. When Emma proposed their first major initiative, a state-of-the-art community kitchen in Queens providing culinary training and meals for the elderly, Alexander didn't just approve the budget. He insisted on visiting the proposed location, a derelict warehouse in a neighborhood not unlike the one where Emma grew up. He stood in the dusty, cavernous space, listening as Emma's voice filled with a passion he had never witnessed before, her hands sketching her vision in the air. He saw not a charity case, but a leader. He saw the tangible, human impact of their work, something far more real than the fluctuating stock tickers that had defined his life. He was seeing the world through her eyes, and it was a world of profound, quiet richness. The barrier between them softened. One evening, as they hunched over architectural blueprints, his hand brushed hers as he reached for a pen. The contact was electric, a jolt of awareness that made them both freeze. He didn't pull away. Instead, his gaze lifted from the paper to her face, and for the first time, she saw something in his storm-grey eyes that wasn't analysis or command. It was wonder. It was a warmth that was reserved solely for her. From that moment on, Mr. Pierce became Alexander, and Ms. Martinez became Emma. The culmination of their work and their transformation arrived on a crisp autumn evening at the grand launch event for the Pierce Foundation. The ballroom was filled with the same echelon of New York society that had silently witnessed Emma's humiliation at the Luminescence months earlier. But tonight, she was not an invisible waitress. She stood beside Alexander on the stage, radiant in a simple, elegant navy dress he had insisted the foundation purchase for her, an equal partner in their shared vision. When it was his turn to speak, Alexander stepped up to the podium. A hush fell over the opulent room. He spoke of the Foundation's mission of investing in human capital and the integrity of communities. Then his voice shifted, becoming quieter, more personal. "Foundations are often built on wealth," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd before landing and staying on Emma. "This one was built on a debt of character that I owed to one person in this room." A murmur rippled through the audience. "Several months ago, in a regrettable display of arrogance, I staged a test. I sought to prove a cynical theory about human nature, and in doing so, I publicly humiliated a woman of extraordinary character for an act of simple, selfless decency." He paused, letting the weight of his confession settle. "That woman was Emma Martinez, and that night she did not fail my test, I failed hers." The shock in the room was a physical force. People shifted in their seats, whispering, their gazes darting between the formidable billionaire at the podium and the unassuming woman standing beside him. "Emma has taught me that true value isn't secured in a vault or traded on an exchange," Alexander continued, his voice thick with an emotion no one there had ever heard from him. "It's found in quiet courage, in unwavering honesty, and in the strength to do the right thing when you think no one is watching. She is the heart and soul of this foundation. She is its moral compass." And he turned to face her fully, his entire world narrowing to the space between them. "She is the finest human being I have ever known." Tears welled in Emma's eyes, but they were not tears of shame or pain. They were tears of catharsis, of being seen so completely that it remade her world. "This foundation is my public apology," Alexander said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, meant only for her but heard by all. "But my private hope is that it is only the beginning of our story. Emma, I have fallen in love with you." The silence that followed was broken by a single spontaneous burst of applause, which quickly swelled into a standing ovation. But neither of them heard it. In the golden light of the stage, amidst the astonished faces of the city's elite, Alexander Pierce saw only Emma Martinez. He had set a trap to catch a thief, and had instead found his own buried humanity. He had sought to measure her worth, only to discover the immeasurable depth of his love for her. Later that night, on a quiet terrace overlooking the endless constellations of city lights, he gently took her hand. The last barrier was gone. "Was that," Emma began, a smile playing on her lips through her tears, "part of the official speech?" Alexander's own lips curved into the first genuine, unburdened smile she had ever seen from him. It was the only part that mattered. He lifted her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles. "I spent my life building an empire of things. You showed me how to build a life of value." He stepped closer, his other hand coming up to cup her face, his touch both a question and a promise. "Is it a story you'd be willing to write with me?" She didn't need words. Leaning in, Emma closed the final distance between them, her kiss an answer that sealed their new reality. In the heart of a city that often celebrated power over people, they had found a different kind of wealth, a profound redemption born from a single moment of injustice. Theirs was a testament to the quiet truth that sometimes the most extraordinary transformations begin simply by being seen for who you truly are.